In this tutorial, I will show you how to use Google Ngrams to do some basic searches. So you can just Google Ngrams, and just click on Google Ngram Viewer. This corpus draws from books that have been digitized, and they go as far back as the 1800s, right? So this really helps us see trends in language. What have people been talking about? Keeping in mind that this is all in books, and when you get there, it already gives you an example. So basically, this chart here compares how often people have been talking about Frankenstein, Albert Einstein, and Sherlock Holmes in books since the 1800s. Right, and then you can do some of your own searches. So let's use the student loan example. You can look for just one word, and then I'll show you how to compare different words. And what we see is that people haven't really been talking about student loans in the 1800s. They started talking about student loans somewhere around 1920, and then really the discussion about student loans has been increasing since 1980 and past the 2000s, right? So it reaches its peak in 2007. Now the data only goes till 2012, right? So this is something to keep in mind. So we can customize it here to make sure we see the results all the way to 2012. And then here's we see something interesting all of a sudden, that we don't really find a lot of discussion of student loans, but that is probably because there's no books here that are on in Google Ngrams that talk about student loans. So we'll just leave it to 2008. And one thing that we can do is compare how people are talking about student loans and student debt, for example. And here's something interesting, right? So the discussion about student loans has increased. Again, we're talking about books here, but people are not talking a lot about student debt, which in my opinion, student loans and student debt would go hand in hand. You can click on any of the years here to see some examples of books where student loans have been, where this term has been used. And then you can click on the word itself to see exactly how the word occurs in the different books and in the titles of the different books. Right, so you can just use this tool basically to study trends about how people talk, how people use language in books, right? So again, keeping in mind that this is not, this doesn't draw from the media, from news, but still, it does pretty much keep the trends that are seen also in society. So for example, let's take a look at how people talk about climate change in books, right? A very hot topic right now. And again, we see that the discussion about climate change has increased a lot in the late 90s, early 2000s. And what you can do here is play around a little bit. These are all books in English, but you can look also by books written in American English. What you'll see, the trend is pretty much the same. We can look at books in British English. Again, the trend is somewhat similar in that the discussion about climate change does increase in the late 90s, early 2000s. And we can compare and see how people are talking about climate change and maybe global warming. Again, we're looking at the British English corpus here. And it looks like for a while, right, the discussion was going hand in hand, global warming causing climate change, but people have been talking much more about climate change than about global warming recently. And then again, we can just look at how it occurs in English overall, and we see a very similar trend. So you can always use this tool to see how trends occur in language, and especially if you work with books, you can see, you might be interested in how some words were used maybe in the 1800s, and if they're still being used or not. So for example, a word that I can think of is maybe ought, right? So ought was very popular in the 1800s, and then it just declined over time, and it's not a word that's being used very frequently anymore.